Welcome back. In our prior video, we discussed entities. We said that each entity has a set of attributes and each entity has a primary key. The next important concept in entity relationship model is the concept of a relationship between entities. What's a relationship? Here is a simple example. A student is taking a course. This student takes course is a relationship between the student entity and the course entity. Or a course is taught in a particular classroom. This course taught in a classroom would be a relationship between the course entity and the classroom entity. Or a course is taught by an instructor. Again, the instructor teaches course is a relationship between the instructor entity and the course entity. In the entity relationship model, we typically represent these relationships as lines between entities, and entities are represented as boxes. Typically, a relationship name tends to be a verb. So, for example, a student is taking a course, then takes is the name of the relationship that connects these two entities. If we have an instructor teaching a course, in that case, the name of the relationship between the instructor entity and the course entity is called teaches. As we're going to see later on, relationships are in fact very similar to entities. For instance, a relationship may sometimes have its own attributes. For example, we may have a relationship between a student and a course, and we call it takes. For this relationship, we may want to keep information such as when a student took the course. In this case, we can add an attribute to the relationship with the semester that the student took the course. So far, we talked about entities and relationships, two relatively simple concepts. One important part of the relationships in the entity relationship model is the cardinality constraint of a relationship. What are the cardinality constraints of a relationship? These constraints define the minimum and maximum number of relationships that each entity instance can have. Let's see an example. We have the following basic entities: courses, students, advisors, and offices. These four entities, they have relationships with each other. So, for example, each advisor has an office, each advisor is advising students, and each student is taking courses. The cardinality constraints of a relationship define the minimum and maximum number of associations that each of these entity instances can have when participating in the relationship. The first cardinality constraint is what we call the key constraint. The key constraint defines the maximum number of relationships that each instance can have. What do we mean by that? For example, each office can have at most one advisor assigned to the office, and each advisor has one office assigned to the advisor at most. In this example, the maximum cardinalities for both sides of the relationships is 1. This is what we call a 1-to-1 relationship. Let's take a look now at the other relationships in this model. We have an advisor who is advising students. Each advisor can advise many students, so the maximum cardinality for the advisor is many. At the other side, each student has at most one advisor, so the maximum cardinality for the student entity in the advisor-student relationship is 1. So in this example, the maximum cardinality for one side of the relationship, for student, is 1, and the maximum cardinality for the other side of the relationship, for advisor, is many. This is what we call a one-to-many relationship. Finally, we have the many-to-many relationships, and we have students and courses. We know that each student can take many courses, so the maximum cardinality for the student entity is many. Each course can also have many students, so each course can be associated with many students, and therefore the maximum cardinality is many. Again, this is an example of many-to-many relationship. We also have the other cardinality constraint that we call the participation constraint. For this constraint, the question is each entity required to participate in a relationship or not. We have two types for participation constraints: optional participation and mandatory participation. Let's see a few examples of optional participation. Let's see the office advisor relationship and examine the office entity. Do we allow an office to be empty and not be associated with any advisor? This would be an example of optional participation for office in the relationship. Let's go now on the other side of this relationship, and we might say that each advisor should have an office. This is an example of a mandatory participation in the relationship. Another example of mandatory participation is that we might have a student who should have an advisor associated with the student. Again, this is mandatory participation of a student in the advisor-student relationship. We may also have the requirement that each advisor in the system should be advising students. So in that case, the relationship has a mandatory participation of the advisor in the relationship, and so in both sides, both for students and advisors, we have mandatory participation in the relationship. Let's examine the relationship of students to courses. We may have that a student may or may not take courses. So for example, a graduate PhD student might not be required to take courses. So this makes the participation optional for the student in the student takes courses relationship. The participation of the student in the student take courses relationship is optional. Now let's look at the other side, on the course part. Similarly, we might have courses that nobody is interested in taking, and therefore we want to allow courses to exist in the database without having any students registered for them. This is an example of an optional participation where a course does not have to be associated with a student in this particular relationship. To summarize, in the entity relationship model, entities have relationships with each other, and these relationships are defining common activities and associations that take place in an organization. Relationships are defined by the entities they connect and also by the cardinality constraints they impose on these entities. The cardinality constraints define whether entities should participate in the relationship. This is the participation constraint, and also define the maximum of how many relationships each entity can participate. This is the key constraint of the relationship. In our next video, we'll see how we can create diagrams to represent the entity relationship models, and in particular, we'll discuss how we can represent the cardinality constraints in these diagrams.